Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and you'll see I'm in a slightly different location this time. Normally I'm either just cooking and you see what's happening on the stove, or else I'm sitting on my couch, which is over there. But this is my desk, and behind me is my computer where I spend an awful part of every day working on my publications. And this past week I've had a few computer problems, not physical problems, software problems, and had to deal with them. And thought, well, okay, let's talk about that a little bit. I think I've mentioned several times that I'm 72 years old, which means I was born in 1951. Back then, I lived in England for a little while after my family moved from Argentina, and then we migrated to Australia in 1957. So in 1957, we lived in a house, brand new house, in a brand new estate that was growing and growing and growing. But at the time we lived there, we were one of about, let me think, probably about 10 or 12 houses on a single street. And each of the houses was pretty much built, at least the bricks and mortar part, the foundation and so forth, by one builder who lived in number one. It was called Backton Street. It was off one of the main roads in Gawler in South Australia. Brand new, and my father was a brand new teacher from England, and so we had to pay rent, but we were found, a new house. Well, new was surprising. My my family lived there for I think 2, possibly 3 years. And when we first moved in, my mother in particular was just horrified. Because first of all, there was no hot water in the house at all. In order to get hot water, you had to use one of several chip heaters, that is, heaters that were heated by wood. The bathroom had a chip heater in it. If you wanted to take a bath, you had to light a fire in the chip heater, let it heat up, and then you could get some hot water. There was a chip heater in the sink in the kitchen, which we didn't use very often because that also required lighting a fire. Now, Australia is hot. You don't want to be lighting a fire every time you want to do the dishes. So they bought very early on an electric kettle. So to do the dishes, we boiled a kettle, and kept it boiling so that we had enough hot water to do the dishes. And the same in the morning for my father when he had to shave. Put on the kettle, he had a shaving mug and a shaving brush and shaving soap and so forth, so he could do that. But clothes and laundry was the absolute shock of my mother's life. We had a laundry room, and the laundry room was fed with water from a water tank that collected the water from the roof, which was corrugated iron, and it fed into the gutters, and then the gutters fed into the water tank and then that water tank fed back into the laundry, um, and there was big stone sinks that you could put clothes in and rinse them and so forth. And to wash the clothes, there was a huge like copper basin set into a cast iron collar with a fireplace underneath it. And so to wash clothes, you had to light a fire under the copper, get the water, at least moderately hot, and then put the clothes into the copper, and then wash them by hand. My mother never had a washboard, but that would have been perfectly acceptable. And then take them out of the copper into one of the stone sinks, where you could fill the sink up with cold water and rinse them, and then into a dry sink. All the while using a hand cranked mangle, so that you could, get the excess water off the clothes, and then lug them out onto the clothesline in the garden. That was my life. No television. Television didn't exist in Australia at that time. We didn't have a phone. In fact, we never had a phone the entire time we lived in Australia. We lived there for nearly 10 years, and we never had a house phone. Television came, I believe, sometime around 1960. And almost all of the programs were imported either from the United States or from England. At the outset, we had two channels, Channel 7 and Channel 9. I don't know how they picked the numbers, but they both were commercial stations. And I used to like to watch the kids' programs in the afternoon after I got in from school. And they had kids' programs starting at about 5 o'clock, I think. And then 6 o'clock they had news, and then 7 o'clock would be some kind of show from either the United States or from Britain, and then signed off at about 11 o'clock. So it didn't really run all day. It only ran from about maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon to about 11 o'clock at night. 11 o'clock at night, they used to play the national anthem with a Australian flag waving in the background, and then that would be it. They'd be gone. They would just show a test pattern for the rest of the evening, night, into the morning. Eventually, they had school programs in the morning and afternoon that could be shown. Let's say a Shakespeare play, for example, which was very common for high school students, and maybe some science programs and so forth. But that was all directed towards schools, and then there was a soap opera called Crossroads that came on. I think it was about 4:30. Then children's program and so forth. And then finally they had a third program which was sponsored by the government, and it didn't have advertising, and it was mostly BBC stuff. They produced very little programming of their own. Like the news they produced themselves, and the kids' programs they produced themselves. All the rest of them were bought from other places. So my diet mostly consisted of 50s stuff from the United States, like Bonanza, Rawhide, I Love Lucy. That's what I grew up with. And then eventually we moved to England, and so we got a telephone for the first time. It was also amazing because the telephone we had, at least in the house where we lived, um, could only make calls within my village. So our phone number was Burnham 771. So I could, I could call like a friend who also lived in Burnham. Let's say he lived in a street a few blocks over, and had a phone number of Burnham 459. Okay, well I could dial 459, and I would get my friend's house. Anything else outside of the exchange, that I probably didn't even have 1,000 numbers. Anything outside of that exchange, you had to call the operator, and the operator would patch you through. You dialed 0, and you get the operator, and you say, "I want Slough 25083," and which was one of my girlfriend's numbers, and the operator, who had a headset on, had a series of plugs that she would, and they were mostly women. When I said, I'm not being gender biased, they were, almost all women, and they would plug, take my plug, should plug one into me, and then plug another one into the exchange in Slough, and speak to an operator in Slough and get her to do the same. And if you wanted to do an international call, it was a nightmare. You had to actually reserve it, sometimes a week or more ahead of time. And there was one time when my elder sister called us from Australia, and she had to send us a letter. The letters take 10 days to get to us, 10 days to get back. So she sends us a letter, or a telegram, I think it might have been, I don't remember, saying, "I want to call you at such and so date, such and so time. Are you going to be there?" Send a letter or telegram back saying, "Yes, we'll be here." And then she had to go through the whole rigmarole of calling up her operator, and she had to get the international operator. Oh man, what a time. And libraries were interesting. When I was at Oxford, I used the Bodleian Library for most of my studies, and they had common books on the shelves, and they had multiple libraries, different ones for different subjects. A special music library, special theology library, special English literature library, and so forth. So some of the common books would be on the shelves, but the vast majority of them were in stacks under the ground. And if you wanted to order a book, you went to the catalogue. My catalogue was a series of open bound books, and with entries pasted on slips of paper into the books. And you could only look up a book by author, and also that they had a certain division. I can't remember the date exactly, but it's something like books published before maybe 1900, let's say. It wasn't 1900, but let's just say it was. That was one set of books that you would look in, and that was closed, that was finished. And then another set of books that was, constantly being updated. So there were lots of spaces for new books to be added. Only alphabetical by author. That was it. So you had to know the author's name, and you had to know the date of publication. You look it up. They had a green slip of paper that you could write down the name of the book, the name of the author, and it would give you a shelf number, and then you put that in. Oh, and you also had to have a seat in a certain library. I used to use the lower floor of the Radcliffe Camera, which was the theology library at the time. So I would say I'm at, whatever, B12, Radcliffe Camera. Then an hour later or so, maybe, sometimes 2 hours later, the book would be delivered to your desk. And you could keep it as long as you wanted. and when you're done, you send it back down. Incredibly tedious. um, we couldn't photocopy anything. You could conceivably get photocopies, but you also had to order that. Like if you decided, okay, I want to photocopy this chapter of a book, you had to fill out another form. This was a white one this time. Name of the book, pages, so forth, and deliver it to a librarian, and might take 2 or 3 days, and you had to pay for it, and it was not cheap. Would be the equivalent nowadays of about £1 a page. And so you didn't do it. I spent a lot of my time copying by hand out of old manuscripts and old books. That was the life I knew growing up. So now we have the internet and we have personal computers. So like if I need to look up a book, if it's on Kindle, I can order it. I mean, usually I can, there's a lot of books I can order for free from Amazon because I have a Kindle account. It depends on the way things work, but if I decide that I want to get hold of a particular book and it's on Kindle, then I just order it and there it is, like now, immediately. Don't have to wait for somebody to bring it up from the stacks for a couple of hours. It's right there. If pretty much any article I want from any academic journal, I can get immediately. Because my university, where I am still registered as a professor, I can go to the library site, I can go to the journals section, I can enter what information I know, author, date, usually title, something like that, and then it'll give me some options, and I can click on something and say, yeah, that one, and click, and there it is, and I can download it onto my hard drive if I want to, and it's all there. So it seems like a different world from the world I grew up in. And it seems like you could say a better world. And in a lot of ways it is. But it has some drawbacks. The Bodleian was a very odd library, but the library at my university was pretty, bog standard libraries laid out according to the Library of Congress system, so by subject matter. And originally we had a card catalog, so you go to the card catalog and you look up the book you want, and you find the Library of Congress number, go and find it. And doing that, you sometimes come across other books that are of like sort of parallel interest, because they're in the same section. So maybe you're interested in the plays of Ben Jonson, and you go and you find a critical edition of one of them. But right around that section are other critical editions of other works by Ben Jonson, maybe something that catches your eye. You can't do that on the internet. I mean, you can in a way, because when you do a Google search, it pulls up everything. But you can spend a lifetime looking at everything. This is a much more narrowly conceived thing. Or if you want to find a journal article, let's say I want to look at something in American Anthropologist, and it's in volume, 63. So I pull volume 63 off the shelf. There may be other articles in that volume that interest me. Again, you don't get that when you do an internet search for an academic journal. And what's even more sort of interesting / frustrating is that I run blogs, and I also have a YouTube channel, and I've had to learn a tremendous amount of stuff that I would never have had to learn in the old days. I mean, basically coding, what they call coding. I used to do some simple programming using Fortran and Pascal back in the old days when all we had was mainframes and punch cards. But I've learned some other ones too, including C++ and C++. But I've also had to learn HTML, CSS, this whole alphabet soup of things I've had to learn. Had to learn what a blog roll was. Had to learn what PHP is. Oh, it's a nightmare of the things that I have to learn. But in order to get the blog up and running effectively and to have a nice web design, I have to learn all these new things, and they keep changing. So I have to keep adding and adding and adding to my knowledge base. Well, this past week, my old blog died, and it died for a very stupid reason. I'd had it up and running for 6 years, and I'd posted on it most days for 6 years, and then it stopped running. And I didn't know why. So getting to the bottom of the problem took some ingenuity on my part, because I kept calling the server, and tech support would say, "We don't know what's happening. We don't know why you can't pull up your site. It looks like," and they would give me various excuses, but nothing really panned out. And then eventually a tech, and we're talking about like a month after this first started going wrong, a tech finally contacted me and he said, "I know what's happened. We have a misspelling of your email. One letter, that's all, in my name. Just one letter. But the way computers work, if one letter is misplaced in an email address or a URL or whatever, it doesn't work. And if you were talking to a human and trying to get something done and something was misspelled, the human could correct it. And in theory, we could probably do that with addresses and names and so forth as well, but we don't for security purposes. So what happened was that my address had come up misspelled, and part of that had been because my old debit card had expired and I got a new one with a new number, and they didn't know what it was, so they had to contact me to find out what the new number was, but I typed in my email address wrong and tried several times and it bounced back. And so they just said, "Oh, don't know," and eventually just canceled my account. And then by the time I found that out, I had also canceled everything. So everything was shut down. I wasn't paying, my domain had disappeared, like everything was gone. So I thought, oh, all right, I'll just let it be. And I let that go for over a year. And then last month I thought, I'm going to start up that blog again, and I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it just one day at a time, as I used to do, but I'm going to do it for 1 year only, and then I'm going to collect the blog posts together and make a book. And that means that the blog post has to be just one page, because it'll be 1 day, 1 page. And when it's finished, it'll be 365 pages, plus odds and ends. And that'll be it. And then I started having problems with this blog. I couldn't pull it up. I could access the dashboard, but I could post, but I couldn't see my posts. Other people could see them. I couldn't see them. And that's a real mystery. So now this is with WordPress, and WordPress doesn't have phone-in tech support. It only has email tech support, which takes an awful long time. It took them 3 days to answer my first query, which is how how is it that I can't pull up my blog? And then usually about 24 hours after that, so a person replied with something really boilerplate. You know, like if you know IT crowd, you know that like one of the things that they always say is, have you tried switching the computer off and switching it back on again? Like I had something like that. And I, replied like, yeah, I've done that and I've done this and I've done this. I still don't have an answer. What can you tell me? And they said something ridiculous to me, like try using a VPN to get your blog up. That means, getting around my server in my building, which worked. But then, after that, I could pull my plug out without the VPN. It just worked again. Like it wasn't working, tried this, tried that, tried the other, tried the VPN, that worked. And now it all works. And so I've written back to the techs at WordPress and said, yeah, okay, it's working. I don't know for how long, but it's working, so thanks a lot. And it just made me think, what has my life become? My life used to be building a fire on a Saturday night in the bathroom so that I could take a bath, or helping my mum light a fire under the copper so that she could do the laundry. And then it became some children's programs in the late afternoon on television. Before I had my supper and before I did my homework, I used to walk to school, didn't have a telephone. It seems like in a lot of ways life was simpler, but you've got to be careful because life was simpler because I was 10 years old. Like, there's a lot of things that adults worry about that 10-year-olds don't worry about. So what was life like in the 50s and early 60s in Australia if you were an adult? I don't know. Emotionally, here's the thing: not any simpler than the current world. One of the things that you will know if you've seen the movie Walkabout is that men committing suicide was a very common thing in those days. Now, why? I mean, I remember. I knew 3 men, I think, who committed suicide whilst I lived there. And I remember being with my father in a pub one time when they were talking about somebody who had committed suicide. And they said, yeah, you never know about Bill. Like one day he's joking and having a good time, and then he takes out a rifle and shoots himself. For no reason. Well, it's not for no reason. It's for some reason. But that was the emotional life that I lived with. And I would think in some ways, maybe it's got better. I don't know whether technology has made things better, but maybe that sense of kind of isolation that a lot of people felt, men in particular felt in those days, isn't so much anymore. Now I'm not saying, believe me, I'm not saying that social media and smartphones and all of that have made us more connected. I don't think they have. If anything, I think they've made us less connected. But something has changed. Something has changed that particular part of life. But back to my original question is, was that life that was simpler better? Well, I was younger. All I had to worry about was whether I got my homework in on time, and whether I could get my arithmetic done without making a lot of stupid mistakes, which I mostly couldn't. whether I could, I loved chemistry and physics, I have to admit. So, I never had problems with my studies there or with my homework. Art, English, mathematics, I hated them. And I'm so glad that I, my life is devoid of them in particular. Latin I was not crazy about either. I wasn't too good at Latin, but I kind of understood it. But you see what I'm trying to get at is that I can't really gauge the emotional status of for 50s versus 60s versus 70s versus now in any kind of neutral way, because I was growing up and my interests were changing. Like the 60s were an amazing time for me, and I loved the music, I loved dancing and all the rest of it. I was a teenager. What's not to love? Except, of course, that I had heartbreak after heartbreak with my girlfriends. But, so, my final point is that to be a historian of this period of time that I've lived through is really almost impossible, because it's linked to the life stages that I've gone through. So now in my 70s, I have a kind of a mellow perspective on the world, and I can reflect back on politics and economics and whatnot with a fair degree of equanimity. But that's not fair in terms of what's actually happening politically, in the countries where I've lived, like Cambodia now. I can be pretty much indifferent to the politics here, which are terrible, because I'm not a Cambodian citizen and I don't intend to stay here for very much longer, and I can't vote, and I'm just not part of the system. Same when I lived in China. Same pretty much everywhere. I mean, I can look at the United States or the United Kingdom at a great distance. I can look and say, yeah, Brexit, sucks. So that means that I've got to show my passport if I want to travel in the continental part of Europe. And I can't work there anymore. But I'm old. I don't need to work. When I worked in Italy, Britain was still part of the European Union. So all I had to do was show my UK passport and I could work anywhere. Now, it doesn't matter. I mean, it does if I would want to live in Italy for a long time. I have to jump through some hoops. I have to jump through some hoops here in Cambodia too. I have to go to an office every year and renew my visas, and so on. So I can't be a historian, and a dispassionate historian of the 50s through to now, because I've lived through them, and they're coloured by not just my opinions, which is one thing, but by my age. so that every one of those eras is an era of my life that has a pin in it and says, oh, this was, I turned 40 in this decade, or this decade I turned 70, and it can't be neutral, but such is the academic life. Anyway, that's my meandering stories about computers and history and my life for the time being. If you like this video, please tell your friends, because I need to build up my algorithm. Please like, please subscribe, and have a wonderful weekend. And I'm going to come back on Tuesday, and I'm probably going to do deviled kidneys, so you've been warned. Have a good weekend.